Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to all. Thank you for making the time for joining us today in this second training webinar by the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which will be about science-based target setting for the maritime transport sector. Along with this webinar, we will be publishing an updated version of the SBTi Maritime Guidance and Target Setting tool, as well as a new document that addresses frequently asked questions on maritime transport targets. My name is Paulina Moreno. I'm a communications manager at the SBTi, and I will be hosting this webinar today. Throughout this 1 hour webinar, experts from the SBTi, Smart Freight Center, and UMAS will explain how maritime companies should set targets, account for greenhouse gas emissions, and address frequently asked questions. Our goal is that by the end of this webinar, you will have gained the knowledge and tools needed to make meaningful action towards a more sustainable future for the shipping industry. But before we start, a few guidelines for this webinar. This is a Zoom webinar. Your camera and microphone are automatically muted. If you have any questions, please send them via the Q&A button that's in the bottom of your screen. Slides from this webinar will be shared after this meeting. Please note that this webinar will be recorded for the benefit of those who cannot attend. Okay, so let's move forward with the agenda for our webinar today. We have scheduled 1 hour in total, but we expect to get through the content in a good deal less time than that, leaving time for questions. We will start with an introduction to the SBTi Maritime Guidance. Then we will move on to the explanation on modeling maritime transport science-based targets, and we will finish off with a Q&A session. But before moving forward, I want to introduce the team working on today's webinar. We have Fernando Rangel Villasana, who's Head of Sectoral Development at the SBTi. We have Jean-Marc Bonello, Principal Consultant at UMAS, and Alan Lewis, Technical Director at Smart Freight Center. I also want to thank those working behind the scenes on this project and on the webinar. So let's start with a brief introduction of what the Science-Based Targets Initiative is. SBTi is a global body enabling business and financial institutions to set emission reduction targets in line with climate science. It was created in collaboration with 4 leading organizations, which are CDP, United Nations Global Compact, WRI, and WWF. As mentioned previously, we have launched in December the Science-Based Target Setting for the Maritime Transport Sector and Target Setting tool to support companies in this industry in setting ambitious science-based targets. And today, we are releasing an updated version of these resources, included a document to address frequently asked questions. Now, let me hand it over to Jean-Marc so that he can introduce you and deep dive into the science-based target setting guidance for the maritime transport sector. Jean, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paulina, for that introduction. And in the next few slides, I'll try to capture most of how we built the trajectories for the science-based targets for the maritime transport industry. So just a bit of background to set the scene. As probably a lot of you will know, shipping is responsible for moving the vast majority of freight and cargo around the world, around 80%, and accounts for around 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions at our last carbon inventory. Having said that, it is one of the industries that is completely reliant on fossil fuels at the moment. Very little of sort of the long route deep sea shipping especially has anything other than fossil fuels. And it's also highly heterogeneous. So it is a very diverse industry in terms of the cargoes, the routes it operates on, the vessel types and sizes also, which makes it quite complex to decarbonize. And I think most pressingly at the moment is that it involves these very high value, long lifetime assets. So therefore, a decision made today about an asset will have repercussions throughout the next decades. And in the timescale that we're operating in, following the IPCC's recommendation around 1.5 degree alignment, we need to make decisions sooner rather than later around all of this. So if we go to the next slide, please. Just to define what is covered by this maritime transport guidance. So basically, we capture in this all the movement of goods and people on ships. So that might involve, if you are a ship owner, it would be sort of your scope 1 because you're operating a ship. But you could also be a cargo owner or logistics service provider, or even just wanting to capture the emissions from employees commuting to their workplace. So all of these different sectors would be captured. What is not covered are some specific exclusions, which are financial institution portfolio, recreational, and fishing vessels as well. And what all of this guidance is aimed for, to provide a toolkit to measure your carbon intensity of the activity in order to inform decision-making around short-term actions towards a long-term decarbonization goal. If we go to the next slide, please, Paulina. So a few frequently asked questions that we've gathered from the experience that we've had since we've launched the guidance at the end of last year. So can this guidance be applied to shipbuilders or the shipbuilding industry? No is the short answer. This guidance only captures the transport of goods and people, as we said. So it is only applicable to those engaged in maritime transport work, basically. And then how does this guidance affect ports? How should ports set a target? So obviously, there wouldn't be any ports without shipping. So it is a vital part of the operation of ports. And depending on the boundary that is drawn around the port's emissions, obviously this can be used to capture scope 3 emissions from vessels operating in that port. But please do have a look at the SBTi general criteria documents as well for a bit more detail. If we go to the next slide, please. We also have had quite a few questions about which vessel categorization or SBTi vessel type does my vessel fall under, for example. And in order to try to capture as many of these vessels as was done in the fourth greenhouse gas study, we have there's a comprehensive list in the technical guidance and also the tool itself, where you can see what your vessel is classed as basically, and then the corresponding SBTi vessel type that needs to be used in the tool for target setting, because as we'll show you a bit later on, each vessel type and size has its own pathway. If we go to the next slide, please, starting to go into how we built the 1.5 degree and well below 2 degree pathways. So like many of these climate alignment initiatives, fundamentally, it's quite a simple process, I guess, to create these carbon intensity pathways. You start off with a carbon budget, which is defined through several different options. Define the transport work demand projection over the period of time that you're looking at, which in this case, we get from the fourth greenhouse gas study. And if you add those two elements together, well, divide one by the other, you basically get the carbon intensity that the industry is allowed over the period up to 2050. If we go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, carbon budget allocation is one of the key parameters when defining these pathways. And we have a well below 2 degree pathway, which was set using the IEA's Energy Technology Perspectives document from 2017. And then the 1.5 degree pathway, which was set using the IPCC's definition of the carbon budget that would keep us to not exceeding 1.5 degrees of temperature increase from pre-industrialized levels. And that can be defined in the global warming of 1.5 degrees document by the IPCC. Obviously, all of the SBTi work is defined on a well-to-wake carbon budget. So we considered all of the emissions, both the upstream emissions, but also the operational emissions. And it also captures the different greenhouse gas species as well. So CO2, methane, and also nitrous oxide in this case, which are the most relevant for shipping. And in the 1.5 degree pathway, because we had to define how we get from the sort of milestones that are defined by the IPCC, we applied a curved trajectory or an S-curve or a logistics curve, which allows for the diffusion of technology in the industry. So as we know, we don't have all of the answers or the technological solutions now. So this is inbuilt into the shape of the pathway as well. So if we go to the next slide, please. Just reinforcing some of the factors that I just mentioned as well. So the emissions, what is the emissions boundary for the SBTi maritime transport pathway? As I said, it is full life cycle emissions, so well to wake from the right at the beginning of the production to the combustion or consumption of the fuel. And is also expressed in CO2 equivalent with 100-year GWP, global warming potential, for those non-CO2 greenhouse gases as well, which I mentioned, so methane and nitrous oxide. The metric that is used to define carbon intensity is the Energy Efficiency Operational Indicator. So this is the EEOI, which you'll be familiar with. That is one of the voluntary metrics from the IMO. And also we frequently get the question why we still have the well below 2 degree ambition in the guidance. And this is because under the SBTi's guidance, scope 3 emissions can be targets, for scope 3 emission reduction can be set under well below 2 degrees. So those companies that are buying in transport work can do that and report those under well below 2 degrees. So if we go to the next slide, please. So here we're trying to paint a picture of what this actually looks like over a time frame. So here we've got a bit of a comparison between what the IMO initial strategy looks like. So the 50% reduction by 2050 on 2008 numbers. So this is the orange line here. But the pathways that are most interest to us are the gray pathway, which is right at the top there, which is the well below 2 degrees. And most importantly, the 1.5 degree pathway, which, as you see, there are two of them. So the dark blue line is the linear pathway, which is defined sort of word for word from the IPCC. And the purple curved pathway is what I mentioned, the logistics curve. So basically, this curve that allows for the diffusion of technology, specifically for the zero emissions fuels coming into the industry. If we go to the next slide, please. So just a bit of clarity around the metric itself. So we mentioned EEOI, or carbon intensity. And basically what this means is we take the total emissions of whatever cargo, whatever journey has been undertaken. It is divided by the distance sailed by the vessel, and also the cargo carried as well. So basically we get a metric there that is CO2 equivalent divided by ton nautical miles. And similarly, we've got a slightly different metric for passenger vessels, which is CO2 equivalent divided by gross ton nautical mile. And this is just because of the operating profile of these vessels. These vessels are basically taking things from A to B all the time, rather than having maybe a ballast leg. So the gross ton metric is more applicable and representative to these vessels. If we go to the next slide. So if we get that, as we said, the carbon budget and divided by the projected transport work over the next few decades, we get the carbon intensity pathways. So basically, again, what we're interested here mostly is that purple curve, the S-shaped curve, which defines the carbon intensity reduction that we need to see in order to be aligned with 1.5. And this is ultimately what lives in the foundation of the target setting tool that is provided on the SBTi website, and where you can plug in your company's information, as Alan will discuss in a few slides' time. If we go to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, the SBTi, being sector specific and going into as much granularity as possible, has pathways that are specific to vessel types and sizes. Obviously, we know that all of these vessels have different operating profiles, different physical characteristics also, which make the different baseline carbon intensity different. So again, in the tool, we have embedded different pathways based on the baselines for different vessel types and sizes as well. So you can see every vessel type and size will have a different pathway, although the reduction will be the same. If we go to the next slide, I think this will be just giving a bit of a background information since the launch, sort of things that happened since the launch at the end of last year. I think 1.5 degrees in shipping has really sort of taken a front seat in many discussions and many boardrooms. And I think sort of one of the things that really showed this was that as the IMO was discussing its updated greenhouse gas reduction strategy, which hopefully will get an update in July this year, all of the countries that sit at the IMO can submit specific texts that says, well, we think that the updated strategy for greenhouse gas reductions should look like this, or should have this specific boundary. And as you can see there in this diagram, a few countries, so Canada, the UK, and the US, along with the Marshall Islands, the Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu, so those are Pacific Island states, basically have stood up and said, look, we think that the SBTi pathway should be the one that the global shipping community should align to at an IMO level. So that's something I think that all of the team at SBTi are very proud of, but it also is a very strong signal that this is seen as a robust pathway by all of these nation states, and they're also their expertise intrinsically. If we go to the next slide. So again, going back to some of the questions that we've been asked over these past few months, and specifically one that tackles some of the other climate alignment initiatives that are specific to shipping, and more specifically, the Poseidon principles, both for financial institutions and maritime insurance, and also the Sea Cargo Charter. So for those familiar, these are 3 initiatives which are designed for and by financiers, insurers, and charterers of the shipping industry. And they also have a similar mission of transparency around emissions. However, the main differences between these is that those initiatives were basically just set as disclosure initiatives, so there's no target setting involved in them. And also more technically, and those initiatives just tackle operational emissions because they are in line with the IMO 2050 target. And also, as I said, their target is not temperature goal aligned, but it is aligned to the IMO's 2050 target. So those are the main differences between those initiatives and SBTi. So I think I'll hand over to Alan next for a bit more detail. Or
thanks,
Fernando.
John-Marc. Yeah, I'll be taking over for the next couple of slides. Yeah, exactly. So as Jean-Marc was saying, the emissions boundary for the that we're using in the sector guidance and or target setting tool is on a well-to-wake basis, and consistently all targets have to cover emissions boundary of the target has to be also on a well-to-wake basis, that is in metric tons of CO2 equivalent, and there is a strong rationale for this. First of all, it's an important precedent of former transport resources that we have developed within the initiative. Well-to-wheel emissions are emissions that happen across the life cycle of a fuel, both in upstream activities such as production and distribution of the fuel, and the direct emissions at the vessel or vehicle. So we have actually decided that this is the right conceptual boundary for transport, as we see that most of the opportunities for mitigation are captured around this well-to-wake boundary, and as well this well-to-wake boundary captures all the trade-offs and the shift in emissions between tank to wheel, or tank to wake in this case, and well to tank. So it is important that companies consider this and that they apply the most accurate and up-to-date emission factors for the fuels that they are using, and that these emission factors are inclusive of the well to tank portion. Next slide, please. We have received a number of questions around this topic, so I'm just going to answer a couple of these questions we have received in the past months about well to tank. So what standards or self-emission factors should be utilized when calculating well to tank and tank to wake? Well, there are a variety of maritime fuels, and the GLEC framework includes well-to-tank emission factors for those. So we actually recommend reviewing the GLEC framework for this. These values will be updated later in 2023 when the Smart Freight Center publishes a new version of the GLEC framework, and I'll let Alan give us a quick update later in this webinar. But this updated emission factors will follow the approach for calculating emission factors set out in ISO 14083. Another frequent question is how are carbon removals factored in? So carbon removals such as CCS happening upstream during fuel production would be accounted for through the emission factor associated with that fuel in question, and that is why the well-to-tank extended boundary makes a difference and is quite important. So CCS would be reflected in the emission factor. However, please note that carbon removals through offsets are not currently accepted by the SBTi. That's a position we have held since the beginning of the initiative, that offsets can be applied above and beyond your science-based target, but cannot count towards the emission reductions required from a given sector. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of target coverage, so once we get clarity on the emissions boundary, we need to match that with the greenhouse gas protocol accounting practices. So this varies per type of user or from the perspective of each of the users of the guidance. So there's two main groups of users: vessel owners and operators, and then there is the cargo shippers and logistics service providers, which are going to be having their maritime transport related emissions reflected in across their scope 3 categories. So for vessel owners and operators moving passenger or freight, the well-to-wake greenhouse gas emissions would be reflected across the scope 1 and a scope 3 category 3. And their base year activity would be either ton nautical mile or gross ton nautical mile, as Jean-Marc explained previously. For cargo shippers, both moving passenger and freight, so ferry, passenger ferries, for example, that category for passenger transport would be reflected in scope 3 category 6 or 7. Though those emissions would need to be accounted on a well-to-wake basis. And if it is passenger only, and there is a typo in this table here, it should be gross ton nautical mile on the right-hand column. For freight, the emissions on a well-to-wake basis would be reflected in either category 4 or 9, upstream or downstream transportation, and the base activity data would be ton nautical mile. Next slide, please. As part of the guidance and to make this consistent with the theory of change and the rationale behind the S-curve or the logistic curve, there's 1.5 C aligned. There is 2 important criteria, sector-specific criteria for companies setting targets. The nearest eligible target year is 2030. So all companies setting a target using these resources must set a target that is no earlier than 2030. The second important criteria is that vessel owners or operators must submit a long-term or a net zero target along with their near-term target submission. That is, they have to simultaneously submit a near-term target compliant with this 2030 base year, and then a net zero target, which is in this particular case, reducing emissions to a residual level in line with 1.5 degree by no later than 2040. So these 2 conditions work together, but the second one only applies to vessel owners and operators. Cargo shippers, logistics service providers are not required to submit. They are welcome and encouraged to submit a net zero target alongside their near-term target, but that's not a requirement. Next slide, please. And lastly, in terms of the applicability of this work, there are some limitations related to fossil fuel activities. As you might have seen, there has been a fossil fuel policy for the last year that is effectively pausing commitments and validations from companies in the oil and gas or fossil fuel sector. This affects how companies can engage with the SBTi. And in essence, it's blocking, well, it's not blocking, it's pausing commitments from companies with direct involvement in upstream fossil fuel activities, including exploration, extraction, mining, or production of fossil fuels. But it also affects companies that have more than 50% revenue from the sale, transmission, or distribution of fossil fuels, which may impact some maritime transport activities. So we actually recommend that companies that have this type of activities review the fossil fuel policy before submitting a commitment letter or submitting a target to the initiative. We also recommend that companies review at all times the latest version of the SBTi criteria, which is available on our website. So I think next slide, please. Yeah, I believe I'm just gonna pass it over to Alan to walk us through how we model targets using these resources.
Okay, great. Thanks, Fernando. As you've heard, the guidance comes with a supporting Excel tool to model the targets that are being set. So if you could click on, please. The tool is designed in the same way as other sector decarbonisation tools are set up within SBTi, so that there is a common format with a an input page, and then tabs for, in this case, both the 1.5 degree and the well below 2 degree scenario. And in what I show through a series of screenshots in the coming slides, we'll focus on the 1.5 degree scenario results just to get a consistent picture and to tell that story. So there's basically one interface there for collecting the science-based targets, and alongside that there is one additional feature, which is an aggregator tool, which is there basically non-compulsory, but to help companies which have their vessels or their activity in different size categories of the same vessel type, and that would allow a company to build a bottom-up situation, and we'll touch on that in the coming slides. So if we can click on again, please. Some frequently asked questions based on the response to the guidance so far. Does the requirement to have a long-term target for vessel owners and operators mean they must use the net zero form and not the near-term target form? Well, actually, the answer is no, in the sense that both near and long-term targets need to be prepared and submitted at the same time when a company is submitting to SBTi, and then in terms of the maritime transport tool, the same tool spreadsheet can be used both to generate the short term, no earlier than 2030, and then the longer term targets, so 2040. So basically just repeating the situation with different input data. And then do companies need to set separate targets for each vessel category and size? The answer to that is yes, because basically we're unless you're a customer of maritime transport and don't have a breakdown of the actual vessel category sizes, which is again a scenario we'll look at in a minute, then certainly for operators, we're expecting companies to build their corporate target bottom up, vessel category by vessel category, and then you have again the option of the aggregator tool to pull all that together. So if we can click on again, please. So moving to the first situation here, an application of the tool, what we see is the input form. And as shown in the header here, we're looking at the situation of a shipper, that is a cargo owner that is using container transport to move some of its goods. And what the form is asking you to do is to start by identifying the sector within the maritime sector that you're using. So in this case, that implies the container ship. And then when you move down to section 2, the vessel category size, in this case, and this might be quite common for cargo owners, if they don't actually know which vessel their goods are being transported on, they may well not be able to assign it to a specific vessel category size. And so what we provide is a default category, which basically captures the overall target trajectory for container shipping. And then what we're asking basically is the company to select a base year, generally the latest year that you have information for, and then your target year. So in this case, nominally we've entered 2021 as the latest year for which data is available, and a target year of 2033. And what the request then is for the full well-to-wake emissions that you've calculated in your base year, your anticipated transport activity in your base year, and then your expected transport activity in the target year. So in this case, you have the situation where if you don't know, or sorry, if you have the total of the metric tons of emissions here in CO2 equivalent, you've got a good starting point, and your activity, and this is built on a growth projection of 40% over 12 years. I think if you can click through, there should be some animations here just to pick out some of those key points. The growth projection of 40% over 12 years is relatively high. It's probably at towards the upper limit of the tool, because growth projections are particularly important for how the emission intensity and the total emissions for the projected period are simulated in the tool. Before clicking on, I think it's worth just emphasizing transport activity again, just to be clear. In this case, is set forward in ton nautical miles, and just picking up on one of the questions earlier. These are the actual tons carried on the vessel and reported either by the operator or known to the shipper in this case. If you could click on. Transport activity is calculated. It's a measure of the amount of transport conducted, and is calculated by multiplying the amount of goods or the number of people by the distance traveled. And given that we're following the IMO's EEOI indicator, then this is based on the actual distance to give an operational efficiency value. The amount of goods quantified in metric tons. In this case, distance is quantified in nautical miles, following normal practice within the maritime industry. And if you can click on again. So the calculation is performed by multiplying the distance traveled on each individual leg by the amount of goods transported. So looking at this simple example of 20,000 tons being loaded at one port, being transported to intermediate port, and then some of those goods being unloaded before the remaining cargo is transported on to the final port. You break it down into individual legs to get your total transport activity in order to get the most accurate results. Although there are some possible simplifications of this, generally their accuracy is not great, and so we wouldn't encourage them if at all possible. If you can click on again, and we go back to the particular example that we were looking at before, the container transport with the cargo owner using the default scenario. This is the example of the 1.5 degree trajectory that corresponds to the input data shown a couple of slides ago. And basically you can pick out that for the total emissions on a well-to-well basis, which is the blue curve on the left-hand graph, you can basically see that the total emissions are very much in line with that company's share of the total greenhouse gas budget. On the right-hand side, you can see that in this case, the emission intensity that was reported by or input by the company based on its calculations at the starting point was maybe about 30% lower than the overall sector well-to-wheel intensity average. And that would mean that in this particular case, this company, whilst moving towards the point of convergence for the industry emission intensity, has to work maybe less hard than would be typical of the average. As you can see, the curve is less steep for the blue line than the yellow line above it. That said, because the growth rate that we set for this particular example was 40%, you can see that it still means that even at that less steep curve, the company is basically still filling its share of the overall greenhouse gas total budget. So if we move on to another example, sticking with container transport, but this time thinking about how a vessel operator would approach this, we would expect that a vessel operator would have detailed knowledge of its vessel operations. In the majority of cases, operators are going to have vessels that fall into more than one size category. So we start here with looking at the vessel size category specified between basically 8,000 and 12,000 TEUs. And again, the company needs to select a base year, a target year, and then for each of those, input its total well-to-wake emissions for the base year, its activity known for the base year in ton nautical miles, and again its expected activity in the target year based on company growth projections. And again, for consistency with the previous example, we've set that activity target to 40% for this example. If you could click on again, in this, we expect that that operator would have more than one size category. So again, in this case, it's just a question of adding that same information into the tool for a different size category. We're showing in this 2 size categories. In practice, the operator may well have many more that it needs to cover, but for the purposes of this, we're just showing the 2. So if you could click on again, the aggregator allows the operator to implement as many different size categories as it has within that up to 20. We don't believe that companies would be able to fill that solely in container shipping. It is vaguely possible that a company that has other vessel types, so maybe if it was also operating in maybe bulk shipping of different types as well, it might fill the aggregator, but it's not a common situation. So basically, the company would fill out the for each vessel category size all the information that is input on the input slide, and the aggregator will produce the total for each of those categories automatically for you. If we then move to the outputs for these situations, firstly looking at the 8,000 to 12,000 vessel size category, in this situation, the operator's emission intensity shown is slightly higher than identified for that particular vessel size as an industry average. So that would mean that the S curve of the blue line is actually steeper than the industry average, and that means that it's going to have to work harder than average in order to have to stick to that trajectory by its target year towards actually meeting the point of convergence. The result of that, when combined with a high growth rate, is that this company is exceeding its share of the sector, and again is having to work very hard to bring that back in line with what's expected of it. And then if you can click on again, basically this is showing the same thing, but for the 20,000 or greater than 20,000 TEU ship. Similar principles are applying, so that if you click that through, within the aggregator, then on the right-hand side, again, you have cells to complete for each vessel size, showing for the target year the total emissions and the emission intensity. And again, the aggregator tool is pulling all that together for you so that as a company as a whole, you can not only have individual vessel type and size targets, but also an overall corporate one as well. It has to be said the use of the aggregator is optional. You can go about doing that using your own tool, but that is provided for your benefit. So it should meet your needs. If we can click on again, I wanted to emphasize very much that this isn't just for the container sector, obviously. So an example with a chemical tanker, again, for a situation where you have an operator, we would expect the operator to understand very clearly its vessel portfolio and to be able to input data for its individual size categories, so the vessels in each. So again, the input process would be very much the same, picking out one size category, entering the total well-to-wheel or well-to-wake emissions in the base year, the anticipated activity. In this particular scenario, we've set it so that the company expects no growth for this particular vessel category size over the 12-year period. And if we can look forward to, in fact, that's an 8-year period, so there's a mistake there, but never mind, sorry. And if you then look onto the, click onto the next slide, what that would be implying is that in this case, although the company is starting with an emission intensity that is significantly worse in the base year, and so it does have to work reasonably hard to get down to that convergence point by 2030. What you see is that actually, because its growth rate at zero growth is probably in practice lower than what is expected for the sector as a whole, it's still able to stay well within the overall total emissions boundary. And I think the point to get across here is that growth or anticipated economic growth is one of the drivers towards total emissions, which we see within the transport sector as a whole, and what is driving total emission growth in the sector as a whole, alongside potentially globalization of supply chains leading to more ton kilometers. So you can see that actually maybe companies managing to control growth of the business, or in terms of the transport activity that is generated, is one way to actually limit total emissions and make meeting targets easier. If we can then quickly click on again, please, to a different situation. For this situation, we've got the same chemical tanker, but in comparison with the previous one, now taking that back up to the 40% growth example. And if we were to toggle between the two, you would basically see that in this one, the blue line on the right is much steeper. And that is purely driven by the fact that if you bring in that high growth scenario, on the left-hand side, the total emissions for the company then become constrained to its total emission share, and so it has to work that much higher, even from the same starting point of emission intensity. So it makes it very clear how the two aspects of total emissions and emission intensity come together in this sort of scenario. If we can click on again. For a ferry operator, as Fernando indicated at the start, there's a slight difference in that we're not talking about ton kilometers, or but we're looking here at gross ton nautical miles. Apart from that, the situation is pretty similar. Again, we've got all the similar input data: base years, total well-to-wake emissions, activity, forecast activity. In this case, again, using a 30% growth rate. And if we can click on again, we get a very similar situation where at 30% growth with an emission intensity that is again higher than the sector average, a company is having to work quite hard. Its total emissions are constrained in order to meet that intensity target by the 2033 date that was set. So hopefully, clicking through again, we would see 40%. So again, an increase in growth, again, making the blue line on the right-hand side that much steeper. Hopefully that brings together through a number of scenarios how the tool and the guidelines are widely applicable across the sector, different vessel types, but always working with basically very similar input data, and always combining the influence of total emissions and emission intensity to drive what the target comes out at. If we can click on to the next slide. In terms of target formulation, there are various different elements that are required for a company to include within its target formulation. So aspects such as the coverage, the scope and boundary. So in this case, we're looking at things like what the vessel type is, or the overall corporate nature, whether it's well-to-wake. You need to understand what the base year is, what the target year that's been set, what the percentage reduction would be, and also what the units would be. So in this case, all those are set out very clearly for an emission intensity target. There are other aspects that may be applicable, such as a note about the role of bioenergy within the meeting of that target. As is often the case, it's important to understand whether there are any step changes within an organization. Maybe a company restructures, it may buy other organizations, it might divest. There may be updates to growth projections. It's entirely possible that might be some changes to emission factors, which is something which is quite topical at the moment in the update that we're putting together for the GLEC framework. And so there are various reasons why it may be necessary to reformulate targets between the start date and the target date if something which is important or significant comes to light. And if you could click on again, just to finish on one other frequently asked question, and this is something which is coming up a lot. It's virtually impossible for someone at Smart Freight Centre to be talking about emission calculations or the GLEC framework at the moment before the topic of book and claim or insetting crops up. So the question basically is, will carbon insetting programs be included in order to help companies meet their targets? And the answer is that at the moment, it's not certain. It may well be the case, but book and claim instruments are the subject of a lot of research at the moment. There are new developments and guidelines coming out all the time. And certainly at Smart Freight Centre, we're at the heart of a lot of that work. We have a multimodal guideline for the transport sector due to be published in around 3.5 to 4 weeks towards the end of June, which we all believe is an important step to actually really showing actually how book and claim can be a useful mechanism to help companies in their decarbonisation of transport sector, particularly in shared use or situations or where fuel tends to be grouped together into a sort of aggregated distribution situation, as is more common in aviation than maritime, admittedly. And SBTi is following this type of development in several different groups, as indeed are we at Smart Freight Centre. And as this situation develops and the market becomes clearer as to what's going to be acceptable and how that is picked up with the greenhouse gas protocol, will ultimately determine SBTi's final approach to that. I think I'd probably better hand over to Fernando because we're nearly out of time.
Thanks. Thank you, Alan. Actually, I'm just going to pass it back to Paulina to walk us through the last part of this webinar.
Yes, thank you, Fernando. As you've heard during the course of this session, we've heard the key role the maritime transport industry has to play in accelerating the transformation to a net zero economy and to really help avoid some of the worst impacts of climate change. And with all these resources that the SBTi has developed in collaboration with UMAS and SFC, business in the industry have now the opportunity to be responsible and raise the ambition as indicated in the criteria of the guidance that our experts have spoken through. So if you have any further questions, please direct them to our info@ contact email, the updated SBTi maritime guidance, the target setting tool, and the new frequently asked questions document are now available on the SBTi maritime webpage, where we will be also uploading the recording of this webinar, and we will be updating constantly the FAQ documents for your benefit. Finally, I want to thank all of our colleagues from the SBTi, Smart Freight Centre, and UMAS who participated as speakers today, as well as those behind the scenes. And I want to encourage you all to set near and net zero science-based targets today to avoid the catastrophic effects of climate change. Thank you all very much, and I wish you have a very good rest of your days.